He stands on the back porch before dawn, where the damp smells like old rope and cane stalk, and the river breeze carries the taste of brackish sleep. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from and what's the time in the comments. Folks in Aberdeen Parish say the fog sits different on a bad morning, closer to the ground like it doesn't want to be seen making trouble. That morning the fog parts around a man's boots and clings anyway. The house settles on its timbers as if bracing for a weight that has nothing to do with weather. Somewhere out in the dark, a whippoorwill calls twice and quits, like it's got second thoughts about singing in a yard like this. He is Elijah Kirsty, near 47, not tall and not short, built lean the way drought builds a man. His hair carries last winter's ash. He keeps one hand on the jam, and the other on a ledger he hasn't yet named aloud. That book is fresh, cowhide tight, brass corners new, like a church book before a christening. He has not opened it out here, not in this damp, but he keeps touching it, and that is close enough to a confession. There was a time he told folks he meant to keep this place modest, the sort of farm a man could walk end to end before supper. He has told those stories less and less, as the ground has fought him more and more. Cane rotted in the year of the blight. Indigo didn't take like the agent promised. The bankman from Baton Rouge carries a small smile he wears like a medal, and a thumb he uses for tapping notes on the table. The New Orleans seed merchant learned Elijah's name by the sound of it breaking. Men who never saw his fields have talked to him about liquidations, as if it meant rain. He has daughters, Elsa, near 20, and quiet as a prayer spoken where it shouldn't be. Nora, 2 years younger and skittish about dark windows. Mara, 16 and trying not to pick fights with voices that only live in her sleep. Their mother, Maribel, moves through rooms like she's measuring pain out of a jar, slow and exacting, never spilling, never quite running out. Folks see her on Sabbath and say she looks drawn, and then they say nothing at all because drawn women are what that road grows the easiest. Down the slope, past the pecans that never quite got large and the well with the bucket that sticks on every fourth pull, settle the quarters. 12 souls, if a tally made by anybody but Elijah means anything. 12 people who know the way shadows go long when white men talk soft. Isaiah carries 30 years and the sort of quiet that comes from spotting traps before they're set. Miriam looks 24 and older, both. Hands cracked, knuckles nicked. The skin at her wrists like a man tried tying time to her and got bored halfway through. A child there, Dottie, does sums in her head with seeds, and hums when she's alone. A boy named Abel, shins scarred, laughs sometimes loud and then clamps it back like laughter's contraband. The house has bolts that face inward. They didn't used to. A man will say a lot of things about security when he wants to hang an explanation on iron. Those bolts didn't go up all at once. They sprouted in winter like steel fungus. A latch here, a slide there, a hasp in a hallway where company never goes. No one in Aberdeen has asked about the direction of those bolts, because asking is a door with a lock of its own. He didn't set out to become a student of law. That came from the sound money makes when it leaves, and how it always goes out the front door but never waves on the way. The parish clerk knows Elijah by his hatband now, knows the way he limps only when stepping into the records room, as if the ledgers themselves shift the floorboards out of plumb. Elijah traced lines on paper for weeks, finger trailing statutes and annotations like a child sounding letters. He caught Latin by the tail and pinned it down in English that suited him. The child follows the condition of the mother, not poetry, not quite, but something a man could build a plank road out of if he planned to move product and didn't plan to look sideways at it. He kept his ear low along the road to the city, caught wind of a man who inks the sort of names that satisfy priests only on rainy days. They call him Rook. That's what men who sell you shadows call themselves, like a game piece and a bird got crossbred. Rook sits a floor up from a tavern where the floorboards oil themselves with spilled beer. He has paper that looks older than the men who'll sign it and seals that shine like payment even before they're pressed. $50 will make a birth happen where you need it to, and another $20 if a baby needs to belong to a woman who never held it. People say evil comes in with a knife or rides a storm at midnight. Often as not, it enters like arithmetic, like grocery lists and shipment schedules. Elijah wrote figures on canvas scraps out behind the smokehouse: interest, freight, seed, gin usage, doctor, feed. He wrote the word yield and drew a thin line beside it, then drew it again longer but could not make the grain appear underneath. On a week he didn't drink, he looked like a man frowning at a door that refuses to remember its hinges. On a week he did, he looked like two men fighting over the same set of hands. 3 times that spring, the sheriff's man rode by on a spotted mare and tipped 2 fingers without stopping. There are roads in this parish where law moves slower than rumor and tires quicker than a mule. Sheriff picked up a note about a runaway from the next place on the bayou and asked Elijah had he seen anybody unfamiliar by the pump road. Elijah said no. He said it like the word wore shoes. He said it with his new habit of looking through the person he was speaking to, past their shoulder, as if a better conversation could be found 1 inch to the left. Maribel started taking inventory of little things that didn't look like anything unless you put them next to each other. The way her husband counted meals like rations in a siege. The way he watched the girls at table. Not lusting, not exactly. Measuring. Like he was trying to decide how long a winter a single body could hold. She found herb bundles in the pantry meant for women's balance, the sort a midwife would use, except Maribel hadn't asked for them, and nobody in the quarters had either. On a Tuesday, she stood in the doorway to his office and watched him close the leather book on a sheet with columns labeled Recovery. She set her mouth and stepped back into the hall as if she'd stumbled onto a grave during a picnic. On Sundays, Elijah sat in the last pew and let the sermon slide past him like rain down a good roof. When the preacher said sin has many fathers but virtue is an orphan, he crossed his boot over his ankle and looked at the window, where gnats threw themselves at sunlight like maybe they could get through if they believed enough. He carried the calm of a man who had declared his actions holy to himself, and then moved his markers to match. The girls noticed the air thicken first. Elsa told Nora not to sit by the back stair after dark. She didn't say why. Nora started sleeping with her shoes on. She didn't say why. Mara carried a nail in her pocket and pressed it into her palm until it left a crescent when she got spooked. She didn't say why either. Sometimes a house announces badness in ways that don't give you words to take into the yard. Isaiah had a way of moving through the work like a man keeping track of smoke, seeing where it goes, remembering where it came from, knowing it will get into the curtains no matter what. He'd been made to stand taller than another man once so a buyer could see how one stack of muscle looked against a different stack. He remembered that man's palm pressing Isaiah's shoulder. He remembered what it felt like to smile in a way that showed no teeth and meant nothing. That sort of remembering makes you quiet to stay sane. Miriam kept time by the ache in her lower back, by how fast bread rose, by where the moon sat when her hands gave out. She listened to the house at night, the way some listen to creek banks for poison snakes, ears turned for the shift in weight that comes before a strike. The first time Elijah locked a door no one had ever seen locked. It was mid-afternoon. He slid the bolt in his study as Maribel stood down the hall with a bowl of lard and a spoon. The sound the bolt made was shorter than she expected, and heavier. She stopped because when metal announces its new job, a woman hears it with the back of her neck. She stood there long enough for the bowl to take the warmth of her hands, and the lard to soften. Then she turned and put it back on the shelf, and wiped her palms slow on her apron. He began to separate the quarters with purpose that looked like decency if you stood far enough away. The men were told to bunk 3 to a room on the east side, for convenience. The women were moved nearer the kitchen for ease. He built a small room, too small for anything generous, and called it storage when asked, then didn't put a single barrel in it. He said there was to be a curfew for the yard, and he said it like he'd say there was to be a frost. Not his fault and unavoidable. In April, he made a trip to the city. He told Maribel it was for a new screw for the press. He returned with a small doctor's kit and books with red cloth spines and law titles. He took his supper in his office that night. Elsa came to the door with a trencher and caught the light in there hitting dust in the air. little bits of the day hanging up like sinners. She looked at his hands holding a thin volume open and thought he looked like men in church do when they've decided what the preacher ought to be saying. He started weighing smiles. He counted the number of times Nora laughed in a day on a scrap, and later marked that scrap with an X like laughter was bread gone stale. He asked Mara had she bled lately and used the word cycle, like a wheel he had a patent on. He told Elsa to avoid the sun between 1 and 4 for complexion. He said it soft, like a kindness. Maribel was not foolish. She had kept this house fed through a flood and a winter where a horse broke its leg and had to be shot 2 days before planting. She had caught babies that weren't hers when other women cried for their mothers and didn't have them anymore. She counted what he was counting, and she didn't write it down, and that made it more real. Rook met Elijah upstairs from a tavern where a fiddler never tuned right and no one minded, because sometimes it's the tuning that makes a man notice he's been listening too close. Elijah gave cash. Rook gave paper that looked like it had lived in a church drawer for 20 years. Rook said, "You'll need a name that fits the hand that signs it." Elijah said, "I have that." Rook said, "You understand the child goes where the name points." Elijah said nothing to that, because he had already spent the reply. He returned to Aberdeen with his pockets quiet, and the ledger in his bag and the names in his throat, ready to be said if the room asked. He showed the girls a version of a father a man puts on when he needs them pliant, concerned about their health, asking after their rest, bringing them tea that smelled like someone dried spring wrong and called it medicine. He told them the world was unsettled, that politics were riled, that sugar prices walked up and down the porch like a dog that needed letting out and wouldn't go. He told them they shouldn't be visiting because men on the road notice. He said it like he wasn't one of those men. He measured out the quarters with a carpenter's tape as if inches could change what rooms meant. He told Isaiah he'd be overseeing for a spell, voice low, as if promotion had come down from a place where God signs paychecks. He said it would keep things orderly while he sorted domestic improvements. Isaiah nodded the way a man nods when the river rises, acknowledging the water without granting it dominion. Miriam woke twice that week with the sense that a hawk's shadow had passed over the yard. No one else saw it. She put it down to a bad dream, and then didn't. She watched Maribel in the kitchen, watched the way the woman folded towels with too much patience, like the towels had said something about her daughters and deserved careful answers. The parish doctor, not the one with an office, but the one with a bag and a horse that tires slow, came by. He listened to Elsa's chest and said the air has been funny this spring, too wet and too full of other folks' coughs. He took Elijah's money and said he'd be back on Tuesdays during the heat. He didn't look any of the women in the eye too long. He's the sort of man who hears his own boots coming down a hall and has to tell himself that's not footsteps behind him. By June, the river had sunk into its banks a little and left a fresh line of mud to measure shame against. Elijah wrote his first serious figures in the ledger that month. Columns, clean as a farm hymn. The ink still blue, the letters stiff like a boy's first time imitating his father's hand. On the top of the page he wrote, "Domestic account," because a man like that believes words behave when you dress them up. He spoke to Maribel one night in the back room while the girls slept. He couched what he meant in phrases like family duty and keeping place. He gestured with his palm open, like a man asking for a quarter to pay the organist. She looked at his fingers and thought about how men present palms when they beg and hide knuckles when they steal. He said there would need to be quiet. He said the parish would misunderstand. He said revenue, he used that word, was not coming from Cain anymore. She laughed once, and it sounded wrong coming out of her, like someone else had borrowed that voice and didn't have the right mouth for it. Then she stopped laughing and said his name the way a woman says a town she doesn't intend to live in anymore. He said the house would be lost if she didn't cooperate, and the word wore a uniform. She left the room without closing the door so the night animals could hear. The first time he turned a lock on one of the girls' doors from the outside, he did it while humming something from a meeting in town about tariffs like the tune would make the task another man's. Elsa sat on her bed with her hands folded and looked at the window and thought about how glass keeps wind out and lets eyes in. Mara kicked the baseboard twice in quick taps like sending a message along wood. Nora walked to the door and put her palm flat and felt the coolness like a fever breaking where no doctor is watching. In the quarters, whispers moved like they always do where white walls listen. A little too fast, a little too loud, then too quiet. Someone said the boss had been asking after women's monthly trouble. Someone said he'd measured a room with his hands and not put a bed in it. Isaiah took off his cap in the dark and ran his thumb along the brim and said nothing, because there's nothing you can say in a house that has started writing its own rules. On a rain day when work came off the fields and into the sheds, Elijah brought Isaiah to the small room by the kitchen and told him it was where paring would be done when called for. He said it like a man arranging dominoes on the table's far end, while the preacher drinks coffee at the near end. Isaiah looked at the plank floor and saw where the knots were, as if knots could answer for anything. He said, "Yes, sir," and then swallowed it, like a man swallowing a tack. Elijah was not a man who thought of himself as cruel. Cruel was personal, vindictive, messy. He believed he was tidy. He believed in numbers. He believed in keeping a house in order. He believed the law spoke to him because he bothered to listen. He liked to think of himself as a responsible citizen in a difficult time. He slept sounder when he kept those words at the end of his day and did not permit new ones. Maribel dreamt of the river, wide and brown, with a ledger floating open, pages turning as though a hand beneath the surface were leafing through. Names rose as bubbles and popped before the air could catch them. She woke with the taste of silt and the urge to scrub her teeth until they squeaked, as if the river had spoken to her from inside her own mouth. The parish bell rang once on a Wednesday, not for church and not for fire. Folks said later they never figured what that ring meant. Some said the bell rope will slip in damp weather and clatter its tongue by mistake. Others said somebody pulled the rope on purpose to see if anyone was paying attention. In the Kirsty house, no one said anything at all, but Elsa paused and Nora crossed herself, and Mara smiled without joy at a noise that did not ask permission. He laid out a calendar. It hung inside his office door where no one else would have to see the marks. He set 2 weeks in red, 3 in black, 1 in green. He told himself it was only organization, that houses with women and fields with workers and the road to New Orleans all demand a kind of clock. He told himself the law had made a kind of fidelity possible that farmers like him had been too busy to notice before. He put a penknife on the desk and scraped dried ink from the nib, and thought about how cleanliness makes writing easier. In July, his trip to the city took him further into the quarter. Rook sat with his boots on the table and asked if Elijah understood that once a name goes into a ledger, it is not inclined to come back out. Elijah said he understood about ledgers. Rook laughed around his cigarette like nothing in this world holds still except the money you've already spent. He gave Elijah a packet, tied neat with blue string, and said to burn what he didn't use. Maribel found the herbs he'd bought were not the ones a woman uses to ease pain, but the ones a midwife keeps in a separate box with a ribbon around it. The box she only opens when she's paid up front and told not to ask questions about the wedding date. Maribel put them back exactly as she found them and made a list in her head of what she would need to keep in the pantry behind them. A small knife, a bundle of willow bark, 3 clean cloths, a single taper candle she would not light unless the house got too dark to breathe. Isaiah stood under the live oak on a hot evening and watched crows settle along a branch in a line like men waiting for their turn to tell a lie. He thought about the last time he'd heard a woman cry that way in the next house over, years ago, when a baby came too early and left like it had never been here. He thought about how that sound gets into a man's hands and makes them shake when there's work to do. He put one palm flat against the oak and felt how trees accept weather without pretending they can change it. On a day when clouds stood still at the parish line and refused to cross, Elijah brought a small box into the house made of tin, with a latch that clicked like a tiny door. He set it in the office and slid the ledger in 1/2 inch, then pulled it back, then slid it in again, testing the way the book and the box took to each other like strangers waiting to decide if they share a language. He locked the box and set the key beneath the blotter, in plain sight to himself, and invisible to anyone else. He began to speak to the girls about seasons, as if they were orchards and he an old man with a basket explaining frost dates. Elsa stared at his mouth and tried to read around the words for the thing that would give her a weapon. Nora watched his hands and counted the veins as if arithmetic could take the place of courage. Mara said no once in a voice that sounded like a match striking. The word made him blink. He smiled like she had mispronounced a foreign place and he'd correct her gently in due time. He put 3 names on a page in the ledger and studied them until they behaved. Then he put 2 more. He did not write the 6th name because shapes like that have a way of drawing eyes, and he did not yet want eyes. He titled the page, Domestic Improvement Number 1, and sat back, the way a man adjusts in his chair after he's decided a thing is now a thing in the world, and will be treated accordingly. In August, the night insects grew loud enough to be mistaken for a kind of rain. The air pressed itself up against the house like it wanted in, and the house, like a tired woman, didn't say no quite firmly enough. The quarters kept their windows propped and their doors on hooks. Miriam pinched out a moth's wings by habit and then cried because she remembered pinching them and couldn't explain why the motions of cruelty keep themselves alive in the hands of the gentle. Elijah went to the sheriff's office with a parcel of documents folded neat, asked about registering certain papers in advance to save time in case of births. The deputy nodded, the way clerks nod when they like neat bundles more than messy questions. The deputy stamped something without reading it and told Elijah the sheriff would be out by Kirsty Farm sometime next week to check on a rumor about horse thieves near the bayou. Elijah thanked him like a man cures his own disease by standing near medicine. Maribel watched him return from the road with dust up to his calves and the set to his shoulders of a man who has put a brick on a scale and called it fairness. He kissed her on the cheek without looking at the shape of her face. She moved in the kitchen like a person tucking into a storm cellar, folding the house around her as if the boards could take a message and pass it down the line to the walls. And then, without ceremony, he began. It did not look like cruelty looks in stories. There were no torches and no shouting. There was a door closed and a schedule met and a voice pitched low, explaining duty to a daughter who understood the word, and not this use of it. There was Isaiah standing one room over, fists at his sides, hearing something inside his chest crack and deciding nobody would get the satisfaction of seeing his face when it did. There was Miriam holding a bowl she did not spill, because spilling becomes a sin when men are watching you for mess. The ledger took its first line that night, a little crooked from a hand that believed straightness could be forced by wanting it. The ink dried glossy. Elijah blew across the page and watched it dull. Watched the letters sit down into the paper like birds accepting a roost. He put the pen away and set the blotter over the words as if smothering them would make them quiet. And perhaps it did for a while. All over the house, people counted. Elsa counted the boards in the ceiling and the number of breaths she could hold in her chest before she had to let one go. Nora counted her rosary with her fingers under the blanket, the beads a set of small round promises that did not hold the weight they used to. Mara counted to 3 and said her mother's name, counted to 4 and said her own. Maribel counted knives and clean cloths and the distance from her hand to the doorknob when the house asked for her. Isaiah counted the windows he could reach if he had to, and Miriam counted exactly how many times Elijah's boots hit the floorboards on his way back down the hall. Outside, frogs spoke their useless opinions. The river behaved like a river, going where it goes, carrying what it carries, unconcerned with ledgers and little rooms and women who sleep in shoes. The bell sat quiet. The parish clerk put a book on a shelf that would sag with other books before the year turned. Rook laid out 3 new seals to dry and thought about whether fish tasted better when the man you bought it from told you it was caught upriver. In the morning, the house smelled like lye and breath. A robin hopped on the rail and looked at nobody. Elijah wiped the nib of his pen with ritual care. He folded the ledger page as if folding could prepare anyone for anything. He went to the window and looked out at the quarters, as though distance were a favor he was doing them. He put his palm flat on the glass and admired how clean it was. He had decided what he was. He did not say the word. He did not have to. The book would say it for him in time. The house learned to keep time by pages. There were clocks, yes. The tall one with the chipped face in the hall, the little brass one that lost 10 minutes by supper. But what ruled the rooms now was the rhythm of paper. The scratch, the blot, the soft lay of a sheet when a hand smoothed it like a patient animal. Mornings came to find a leather book turned open in a square of light, and a man practicing a tidy script he did not have as a boy. Even dust learned which way to float so it wouldn't catch the sun wrong on a figure he meant to hide. He called it domestic routine when he spoke aloud, soft and reasonable, the way a man explains a fence line to a neighbor. In his ledger, the language changed. He wrote interval, recovery, delivery, placement. He put initials where names belonged, then graduated from initials to symbols, little marks that looked like seeds or fishhooks or bells. The page made a kind of field he could plant and harvest without weather. He favored blue ink. He said to himself, "Blue settles better in the paper. A lie can be made of color, and a man will still believe it if it tidies up the margins." Elsa took to the back gallery at dawn, when mist held to the low ground and the roosters argued with a certainty she envied. She wrapped her shawl twice and kept a tin cup in her hands for the heat. That was where she learned to breathe carefully. If she drew too much air at once, her chest caught on it. She had not been a delicate child. The delicacy had come on like a trick of the light, revealing itself only when a certain angle fell over her. She watched the yard and learned which footsteps were safe to hear and which made her mouth dry. Nora stayed thin in that season. She slept with a catechism under her pillow and a hat pin tucked in the straw tick, a habit with no plan behind it except the comfort of something sharp. There are girls who speak a steady stream when the world goes bad, and girls who go to ground, tunneling into themselves the way a mole will make a house of roots. Nora went quiet enough to be mistaken for absent. When spoken to, she blinked twice too slow, like someone waking at the wrong hour and pretending it's day. Mara, the youngest, wore her anger bluntly until she learned it paid to round it off. She had once said "no," bright and quick as a struck match. That word came fewer times now, and at a cost she could measure in sleep she did not get. At dinner, she stared at the white of the tablecloth like snow on a field she could not cross. At the pump, she pulled extra hard, making the chain slap the stone. There were small ways to disturb a house. Those were worth cataloging. In the quarters, word didn't carry as gossip so much as weather report. Isaiah called folks by name less and less. Saying a name wrong in front of the wrong mouth is how a life gets shorter. He took to fixing tools before they needed it. Wire brushed hinges that weren't stiff, scraped mold from strips that hadn't turned yet. Busy hands keep thoughts from slipping their halter. Miriam, for her part, saved string from sugar sacks and put it in a jar with other string until the jar looked like it held a heart gone gray. A person needs something to keep for later when nothing that matters can be kept. He built out the small room the way a practical man does a place he refuses to describe. Plank walls planed smooth, no nail heads proud. Floor scrubbed with lye until a nose could not remember what else a home ought to smell like. He put a hook too high up to be for coats and did not use it. He placed a chair just far enough from the corner to make a space a body would have to cross. The window stuck at 3 inches. The light came in harsh and straight. He stood there in the afternoon and adjusted the chair by thumb widths the way a careful farmer sets seed drill before first pass in spring. He told Isaiah he'd be responsible for order. The phrase liked his tongue. It made him sound reasonable to himself. He explained it was to keep foolishness from spreading. Isaiah's swallow stuck halfway down. He said, "Order, yes you," and his mouth felt around the word like a tongue looking for a chipped tooth it already knows is there. Miriam mended shirts that did not belong to any man she loved. She cut thread with her front teeth and worried about how quickly the cut fibers curled back on themselves, eager to forget their length. She listened to voices filter through wood the way creek water talks through roots, words abrading on grain. She recognized the doctor's voice first. Low, careful, not proud, not ashamed exactly, but priced. He said, "Understood" 3 times in 1 minute, and left with money folded once, twice into a breast pocket he didn't pat to check. There is a kind of man who does not count money he is sure he shouldn't have. The doctor came on Tuesdays. He knocked with 2 knuckles twice and then let himself in, a habit men pick up when houses teach them the door is a formality. He kept his eyes on his bag. He asked about general health. He did not ever say the names of the girls unless he had to. He said the eldest, the middle one, the youngest. A man can make anything smaller by putting it in a category. He carried tinctures that steadied the heart, and steadied a hand, and unsteadied a womb. He stayed no longer than necessary. He mounted and rode away like a postman on a route where letters are more dangerous than knives. Elijah's trips to New Orleans settled into a pattern. He said openly he was sourcing supplies with better prices downriver, which was likely truer than lies he used to tell. Rook's room above the tavern smelled like warmed ink and sour beer. Rook's hair was the color of washed-out coins, and he wore a waistcoat a little too tight, the way a man does when he means to suggest prosperity to strangers and has no better proof. He set papers out like a dealer lays cards, certificates blank but for a seal, baptismal notes with dates that would comport if the clock in the right rectory slept for a day, sale slips where the left side had a place for a mother's name someone else would sign. Elijah touched the embossing with his thumb. The raised edge pleased him. It was a texture that said a thing existed before anybody thought to ask if it should. "Keep them dry," Rook said. "The swamp air eats more than nails." Elijah nodded. Rook flicked ash into a saucer and did not look at it. A man who believes ashes mind themselves. On the way home, Elijah stopped at a shop that sold him a new kind of lock, the sort with an inside catch that bites quietly and holds hard. He held it in his palm on the wagon bench like a strange egg, and thought about the first door he would show how to use it. He reached the Parish line before he realized he had not eaten since dawn. Hunger came on him then, with the sharpness a man recognizes when he's been starving for something other than food. He wrote prices in his ledger. He did not call them that. He called them valuations. He wrote ranges. $220 for a child whose skin might pass in a dull room if nobody asked hard questions. $270 for lighter eyes and a complexion that made New Orleans men say the sort of words they think sounds continental. He hated commerce that depended on caprice and pretense, but had learned to arrange his discomforts in an order he could tolerate. Law first, profit second, pretense last. He stacked them in his head like cordwood. He had been a better man when he stacked feed that way. He noted that fact and shut the book on it. The first birth came late that summer, hard enough to have meaning but not hard enough to stall the machine. It did not happen in the little room. It happened in the big house with the curtains drawn and Maribel's hands doing what hands do when they have done this before for women who never set foot in this house. It was quiet in the way battles can be in the brief moments between volleys. A baby entered the air like a debt come due. A small body, and a sound that didn't decide whether to claim the world or complain about it. Maribel wrapped it, examined it, did what midwives do when they mean to honor the old rules, even if nothing else in the room pretends those rules exist. Elijah took the child before the mother had a chance to learn its weight. He did not hold it wrong. He was not careless. Carelessness had no place in a house that had made a pact with the counting of days. He said to Maribel, "I'll place him where he'll be looked after." He said it in the tone a man uses for moving glassware from one table to another. He did not look at his daughter's face. Looking at faces has a way of teaching a man words he might not want to learn. Isaiah was at the door, and then at the bottom of the stairs, and then out under the sky before his body had made a plan for any of it. He stood by the kitchen steps and stared at the iron rail where his hand did not land. His chest moved like a man who had run and stopped and was not entirely convinced stopping was better than continuing. He did not speak because any sound would be the wrong one. Miriam leaned in the doorway of the storehouse and watched him watch the house, and thought about all the objects a person becomes when the right man refuses to call them by their names. The child went to a woman in the quarters whose baby had not lived the winter. Elijah arranged that with the brisk efficiency of a farmer doling out feed. He filed toward the office and took the vellum from its blue ribbon, set the seal in place, and put a name on the line where a mother's name belongs. It was not the mother's name. It was a name that fit neatly. He blotted the page. He blew. He pressed the seal with the heel of his hand to make sure the paper learned what it was meant to be. He sold that first infant in the city 3 weeks later. He did not attend the exchange. Men like him pay for discretion, not for the spectacle. He heard about the sum by way of a man who had a man who handled it. He sat at his desk with the bag clinking and did not count it. He listened instead, nestling his ear to the mouth of the leather like he could hear coins making promises. Outside, a rain came down sudden and straight. The yard smelled rinsed. Maribel sat on the back steps and felt water soak her hem and did not stand up. Elsa lay on her bed and looked at the ceiling and put her knuckles in her mouth to keep them from clicking together. Nora jimmied a window latch 2 inches open and held her breath. Mara found the nail in her pocket and pressed hard enough to leave a perfect arc. The mark stayed until morning. Some marks want to be remembered. Some insist. After the first sale, the machine found its tempo. A ledger page filled quicker. Numbers grow brave once they discover they can breed. He shortened language. P for placement, V for valuation, R for recovery. If a stranger ever saw a page, it would read like an inventory, and a stranger would not be wrong. He scrupulously staggered dates, a man who liked the tidy of even distribution. He took pride in distribution the way some men take pride in a straight furrow. He told himself he was improving the domestic economy. The phrase bloomed inside him with the same false sweetness as certain flowers that only smell good because they whisper about poison. He went to the yard and nodded to Isaiah as if to say, "See how order looks?" Isaiah tipped his cap and thought about order arranging itself into rows at gallows, and pretended that was not a useful thought for a day when work still had to be done. Nights, Maribel moved on a track that looked normal if a person didn't know what a normal night used to be. She folded towels, she dipped cloths, she reheated broth. She kept a small bundle in the pantry behind a sack of flour, willow bark, 1 clean blade, 3 lengths of linen, a candle stub. A woman who does not plan for the worst in a house like this becomes the kind of woman who must ask forgiveness she does not believe in. She said little to the girls that would make a story. She taught them how to wash their hands twice and to keep a cloth near the bed. She told them to stand up slow if the room tilted. She told them to call her by her first name if they needed her in the night, and did not want that word to carry a mother's shame. A second baby came on heat that made the porch pitch feel sticky, as if sugar had gotten into the wood. That child breathed with a wheeze that sounded like a hinge. Maribel tilted the tiny head, patted, did the little dance women do kneeling next to a bed when all the saints have gone silent. The wheeze settled, and the child slept, untroubled by the arithmetic it had been born into. Elijah took the baby after 1 day, 2 nights. New policy. Said infants thrive better when separated early. He kept saying policies like he was a committee and not a single man. He logged the mother as someone who'd need encouragements, if another interval was to progress on schedule. He did not examine the word encouragements. The man did not examine much of anything anymore except paper. Nora started counting church bells. The little parish bell went on its own schedule, a wind or a boy or a rope pulled by no clear will. She gave each ring a meaning. 1 ring meant wait, 2 meant hide, 3 meant do not ask the question the mouth wants most to ask. Elsa watched her at it and let her be. If a person finds a system that keeps air moving in and out, it is not neighborly to interrupt. Mara began to approach mirrors like she wasn't certain they would recognize her. She took to wiping them with a rag before looking, as if whatever lay between her and her face might be the thing that kept her safe. She practiced standing in a small room with her feet planted firm, shoulders back, breath low, eyes level. She practiced not shaking. When she failed, she practiced failing quiet. The sheriff came past in October and asked about horse thieves up on the Bayou Road. Elijah stepped out under the gallery and gestured at the fence line like men do when they plan to look cooperative. The sheriff asked if all was well. Elijah said all was well. The sheriff's horse swished its tail, and the sheriff watched the horizon beyond Elijah's ear and then said, "Folks got to mind their own houses." Elijah said that was his intention. The two men did not shake hands. The sheriff tipped his brim, and the horse picked up slow, a gait that looked thoughtful if a person was inclined to poeticize a creature bred for hauling men. Another certificate came in the post by way of a clerk who enjoyed the feel of wax under his thumb. Elijah paid the clerk to forget he'd seen the envelope. He wrote a letter to the rector downriver with a donation, phrased in terms a churchman appreciates: charity, remembrance, a family's quiet request. He received a polite note in return, the sort which offers no specifics and sings the tune of community like a hymn with half the verses missing. He filed it with other papers which made a pocket universe where everyone agreed to speak softly and carry no torches. By winter, the house had developed rituals the way a broken bone sets its own new rules. Maribel sat at the foot of Elsa's bed every evening and told her to look at the lamp's flame until it went double and then back to single. She told her to count that cycle as if it were breath, a little trick to keep night from rushing her. Nora asked to sleep with the door cracked 2 fingers. Maribel measured it with her thumb and kept it there. Mara asked to keep her shoes on. Maribel let her. The house learned to step around new habits like furniture somebody moved and nobody admits they tripped over. The third sale was late by a week because the river had its opinion about schedules. Elijah paced, counted money he would have, spent it twice on paper both times, paid one debt in his head, and set aside the rest for seed. The men who held his paper did not like the man he was becoming but appreciated the discipline he demonstrated. They sat in Baton Rouge and New Orleans and the Quarter and spoke about him as a file, a case, an account. That is a kind of relief to a man like Elijah. Being someone's file means the world can be managed. Maribel went to the church on a weekday and found it empty except for a boy polishing the communion rail. She lit a candle and did not say a thing. She looked at the candle while it ate itself and thought about how light can spend itself until it dies and not be called foolish. She put a coin in the poor box because that is what a woman does when words won't start. Outside, the air felt colder than it was, a trick the body plays when the heart wants to lie down and cannot. A set of twins did not survive the winter. Elijah wrote nothing on the ledger that night. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the stove's iron belly. He did not rage. He did not weep. He called it loss. He placed the word where he placed spoilage for Cain. He did not add it to any column. He did not know where to put it to make it less than it was. He went to bed with his boots by the door and woke with the taste of ash and said nothing to any person living. Isaiah dug 2 small graves near the old pecan where the ground was easier. He worked with a care that made the job take longer than a boss who liked speed would have preferred. He packed the dirt as if it mattered to someone who would never lie still properly anyway. He pressed his palm to the mound because touching the earth is how a man explains to himself that work has end points. When he finished, he sat on his heels and let his breath come in slow. Miriam folded cloths no longer needed and put them in a box she labeled in her head. Wait. A woman learns to store things she cannot name under a word that buys her time. Come spring, the machine resumed. Schedules tighten when a season turns. Elijah took a particular pleasure in making numbers work across months, a vanity of men who think calendar pages respect them. He mapped intervals to avoid overlap that would tax the house. He even allowed one recovery to extend by 8 days when he saw Maribel walking with her hand on the banister, as if the house leaned. He considered that kindness. He put a dot by it, the way a boy puts a star by a good sum. Rook raised his price by a quarter. He said seals cost more when the quarter floods and the wax goes bad and the man who does the embossing drinks up his own profit. Elijah paid and did not argue. He asked about a different parish's record keeper and what he liked in exchange for forgetting. Rook said the man liked dove pies and flattery, not necessarily in that order. They laughed a laugh that sounds like business and clinks like a glass in a room where toasting is done to keep silence from thinking it runs the place. The doctor asked for double on account of travel. Elijah paid because not paying changes the kind of man a professional will agree to come see when a lamp is low. The doctor put eyes on Mara longer than he should have and then snapped them away because some sins bear witness on their own and do not need your help. He listened to Elsa's heart with a tin trumpet and said she should rest more and not lift heavy things. Elijah said she wasn't lifting heavy things. The doctor pursed his lips the way men do when they think a lie is in season. Nora bled heavier in those months and fainted once holding onto the banister. When she woke, her first thought was that the wood felt warm. That thought embarrassed her. Embarrassment is a useless companion in houses where the floorboards have learned too much. She started keeping cloths in the pocket of her dress like contraband. Elsa learned to braid her own hair slow to keep her hands busy while her insides throttled. Mara took to sleeping in the day and sitting awake while the house breathed at night. The bugs on the screen spoke in patterns she imagined she could read. She did not read them. She learned them anyway. A baby born that spring came out silent. Maribel rubbed and coaxed and did the little slap, the serious insult midwives give a soul that is considering refusing its station. The baby gasped once and then caught the rhythm the world demanded. Elijah took it by the back door. He handed him to Miriam because the other woman's breasts were sore from milk that had nowhere to go, and someone had to. Miriam pressed the child to bone and skin and thought about how milk is a kind of surrender you offer to a life you did not choose and still call it yours. The sale after that fetched a price higher by 20 than Elijah had planned, an event that made him sit down quick and study what variables had shifted. He noted a skin tone lighter than prior, a tuft of hair that matched no one who would be asked in public. He did not write the word most men would have written to themselves on that subject. He wrote market preference trending. If a man can convert desire into data, the world asks fewer questions in rooms where men hang maps. Rook sent back a note. Consider different font on the rector's letter. Elijah purchased a new nib. He practiced a softer hand. The letters relaxed. The rector's clerk wrote again and said a hymn had been sung for a family's intention. It was the best language money could purchase without the stink of heresy. Elijah filed it with the other papers. He pulled the drawer out and pushed it in twice before leaving the room, a habit like a man knocking on wood for luck and calling that reason. At the quarters, a woman named Ebina miscarried. No one told Elijah for 3 days. Isaiah supervised the burial of blood and tissue as if it were a prince. Miriam held Abina's hand and sang an old tune under breath. The boy Abel stood at the doorway and chewed the inside of his cheek until the taste of iron turned into a private sermon. Maribel came with a cloth, and that was how Elijah learned it. He asked for the ledger. He turned a page. He wrote, spoilage. His pen balked. A small hesitation. No more. He did not look at the word long enough to see it wriggle. Later that week, he sat on the edge of his desk and thought about acquiring another woman for the quarters, younger if possible, the way a man thinks about acquiring a new plow horse when the old one develops a hitch. He did not have the money for it then, and that fact irritated him. He made notes about seed. He sketched a plan to move from Indigo back to Cane when the riverheads behaved. He calculated weather into numbers and felt relieved, as if storms could read. The sheriff's deputy stopped by and sat on the steps and told a tale about a traveling man stabbed on the river road. He laughed at his own jokes before he finished them. He asked after the women folk. Elijah said they were well enough. The deputy chewed tobacco and spat a thin arc into the yard. He did not ask to see anybody. He rose, put his hat back on his head as if it belonged to him less than he belonged to it, and rode away with a backwards wave. The house did not relax. Houses learn better. That year's heat came up like a boil. Screens grew gummy. Water in the cistern tasted old. At night there were too many sounds and not enough. Frogs pontificated and then fell silent, as if they had been warned off. The moon, when it appeared, slid into the rooms with a grin. Mara sat awake and stared at it and thought of it as a witness that was going to lie on the stand. She hated it anyway. The fourth child taken to market had a cry like a reed whistle. The sound chased Isaiah into the yard and out beyond the pecans before it wore itself down. He stood with his hands on his knees and did not vomit. He looked at the dirt and saw a stone he'd forgotten he'd left there and made a note to move it tomorrow. A man will manage what is movable when confronted with what is not. Elijah sat with the money and paid the doctor in advance. He paid the sheriff's deputy's brother, who wasn't owed anything but would be useful one day. He paid a store account. He set aside for seed. He felt like a man who has discovered how to cut holes in a barrel to drain water without anyone noticing. He believed he had become good at something. Men are dangerous when they decide competence excuses them. Maribel went hard quiet. A hard quiet is different from other kinds. It has edges. The girls learn to walk around it like a pond in thaw. There are places thin as lies and places that'll take a boot. Elsa stopped trying to talk in ways she'd been taught girls ought to. She adjusted her language to fit new shapes. Nora wrote a note to herself she did not sign. You are not the reason. You are the room. She tucked it under the mattress and slept better for 2 nights. Mara took to reaching for Maribel's sleeve and then not. She kept her fingers to herself and put her mouth to the place inside her elbow where the skin folds and tasted salt. It grounded her. The parish bell rang twice wrong on a Sunday. The preacher said nothing about it. After service, 3 women stood by the back fence and spoke about somebody else's scandal. Maribel overheard them and recognized the comfort in having a scandal you can safely share. She wanted to hand them hers and see if it broke their teeth. She did not. She walked home. She met Miriam in the road and the 2 women did not greet each other, because greeting suggests you are not already speaking. By late summer, the house had 3 kinds of silence. The one before, the one during, the one after. The first stretched thin. The second went thick and greasy. The third fell heavy as a wet quilt. The girls owned the first one when they could. The second got wrestled on them like a criminal's coat. The third they carried often in their hands, palms up, no place to put it down. Rook sent a letter with a note about a new ink that held up better under damp. Elijah bought 2 bottles. He wrote the bottles into the ledger under expense, and then crossed the word out and wrote investment. He liked the feel of that better in his mouth. He started to say investment in other sentences and return, and domestic return. He used them like a man who has taught a dog tricks and will not stop calling them out at table. When the 5th sale came, the buyer sent a note by way of a second man with a comment Elijah treasured. Satisfied. He copied the word into the margin and drew a small box around it. He had once saved the first braid he cut from Elsa's hair. He had put it in an envelope with her name written careful and given it to Maribel for safekeeping. He thought about that envelope and went not to the drawer where he imagined it lived, but to the ledger. A man can only keep one relic at a time if he wants to sleep. Maribel began to make lists she burned as soon as she had made them. Flour, salt, vinegar. Willow bark, clean linen. Water brought early before the well felt judged. She included words whose only purpose was to be burned. Mercy, door, river. She did not believe in magic, but believed in the power of smoke to carry what a mouth cannot hold. She told herself she would not become the kind of woman who waits too long and then calls her waiting faith. She counted candles. She began to consider rope. Rope is a terrible consideration. It presents too many paths to failure. One night, stormlight turned the yard the color of dishwater. The wind slapped the house like a reprimand. The lightning showed the little room's window stuck open those 3 inches, the curtain's hem jumping like a fish hung wrong on a line. Maribel stood in the door of that room and put her hand on the jamb and felt an old sensation come back to her, the one from the day she birthed her first child, and realized that love had made a hallway in her that any pain could run down and find a place to sit. There is an ache that doesn't leave. It just changes its clothes. Elijah came behind her and spoke about the schedule as if weather should apologize for inconvenience. He tapped the ledger with a fingertip to show where the lines marched. He said, "We're keeping tight." She said nothing. He hated her quiet because it did not offer him anything to push against. He went back to his chair. He wrote a date. The doctor failed to come once and sent a note about a buggy wheel. Maribel did the work without him and did it right. She handled blood, breath, panic, the little blue of a child deciding whether to commit. She held a head and turned it. She told a girl to look at her and the girl did, and that is how 2 lives made it. Elijah put another tick. He folded money into an envelope that had a name on it and sent it by a boy. He wrote the boy's time and amended wheel into expense and then crossed expense out and wrote cost of doing. The phrase rolled around his head like a marble and found a groove. Isaiah came to the porch after that and asked for time on a Sunday. He asked it with his cap held right and his back straight. Elijah said, "Work does not stop for God." Isaiah said, "God does not stop for work." The 2 men looked at each other like a mirror had been set down on a table, and neither wanted to be the first to notice his own face in it. Elijah told him to go on and be back by supper. Isaiah walked slow as a man who will not thank a thief for returning a shirt and calling it charity. Miriam prayed there in the quarters in a way that would have made a reverend frown for being too close to older things. She tied 3 knots in a string and put it under a mattress. She wrote a psalm on a scrap and stuck it in the eaves. She whispered names to a corner because that is how women save sanity when nobody will turn to listen. She pressed her forehead to the cool of the outside wall of the big house and pretended the earth was a friend with a hand big enough to hold her skull for a minute. As autumn turned, the parish announced a fair. The girls did not go. A neighbor came by with a basket of hard pears and a story about a man in Plaquemine swindling his own kin. Maribel laughed the wrong laugh again. The neighbor looked down, found a hangnail to study, and said her goodbyes too fast. After she left, Maribel held a pear in her hand and tested its weight. The fruit was heavier than it looked. A person can carry a heavy thing if it looks light to the neighbors. That is a kind of skill. It will kill you if you practice it too long. Elijah got sick for 2 days with a fever that broke into a sweat that smelled like iron. He lay on the bed with the ledger not 10 feet away and did not touch it. Maribel stood in the doorway and thought about ending a problem while the problem slept. She thought the thoughts a woman thinks when she knows no court will say yes and no priest will save what's left. She did not do it then. A person likes to believe there will be a better night. That belief keeps breath going. It also builds gallows. When the fever broke, he woke with the energy of a man granted a reprieve by a judge he'd bribed in a dream. He walked the fence lines. He checked the gate latches. He counted shovels in the shed. He told Isaiah to mend a gate that didn't need mending. He used the word standards. Isaiah said nothing. He held a nail between his teeth and hammered like a man playing a tune with 4 notes and no harmonies. Nora tried to write a letter to nobody. She wrote "Dear," and then stopped because putting a name after that word makes a body real, and she had had enough of that. She folded the paper unfilled and put it in the Bible and shut the cover quick. She liked the sound the cover made when it slapped, like a hand catching another hand before it could point. Elsa's hair began to fall in the brush. She counted the strands each night and then stopped counting because numbers can become weapons if you bring them into bed. She braided what stayed. She put the brush away where she couldn't see it. That is what a person does when the evidence of something breaks more than the something itself. Mara found the bell rope one afternoon when she was not supposed to be in that part of the church. She touched it with 2 fingers. The rope twitched like an animal waking. She did not pull. She imagined it. Imagining has its own sound if a person listens hard. It sounds like a strike held in the throat. She let the rope fall back and walked out, and did not look at the altar one more time than she had to. Another paper came from Rook recommending a different parish for certain filings because the clerk there had a nephew who drank, and a misunderstanding about dates. Elijah made a note. He had a map in his head of men's vices and the roads between them. He favored efficient routes. He believed sin ought to be made to serve a purpose. He did not use the word sin for himself. Isaiah began to meet Maribel on purpose. Not collusion, not yet. Two people standing under the same weight sometimes duck in the same direction and see each other there. He told her in few words who was sleeping light, who was not eating, who had a cough likely to turn. She told him the schedule as much as he needed to keep a person out of the wrong corridor at the wrong hour. They said almost nothing, because words are a currency you spend faster than you think. On a cold morning with a sky hard as tin, the 6th sale happened. The buyer was late. The note came anyway. Elijah took it as if the weight of expectation could stand in for the weight of a child. He put the blotter over the ledger and pressed down hard. The paper wrinkled. He smoothed it. He put his palm flat on the page and felt the give of fibers. He closed his eyes and saw pale blue. He told himself he had delivered the house. He stood and told himself he had saved it. He thinks both thoughts until they braided together and became a rope he could climb hand over hand. Out of a pit he had emptied himself. The machine had eaten a year. Houses can digest anything if fed schedules, and men determined to call the chewing orderly. The girls were altered in their labeled ways. Elsa wore her quiet like a shawl nobody could take. Nora wrapped herself in rules so strict they turned elastic and sometimes snapped, sometimes stretched to hold something bigger than they were built for. Mara learned to move like a cat that has lived too long in a house where a boot falls without a foot in it. Maribel set her jaw and touched the little scar on her wrist she got from a pot when she was 17, and told that girl inside her she'd make good on old promises, even if it meant using tools she had once refused to recognize as hers. One night in late year, the bell rang once, then stopped, then rang again, like a man changing his mind about telling the truth. Maribel sat up in bed and reached for the edge of the mattress and spoke a name that was not in the house anymore, a child's name from a time when Hope had a clean dress. She covered her mouth with her palm and held the sound in until it learned manners. She stood, feet cold, and went to the hall. The door to Elijah's office was ajar. The ledger sat open. Her hands shook only enough to make her aware they were still hers. She went in. She put one finger on a line she could not read at that angle. She pulled the blotter back and read. She read more. She read until the lines swam. She found the mark for encouragements and did not need a key. She read a name that was hers represented by a mark that was not. She smiled into the space between her teeth and her lips, a small, unlovely thing. She laid her hand flat on the page and left the ghost of her palm in oil and heat. In the corridor, floorboards told a story about weight approaching. She closed the book soft, a mother pressing a fever child to doze. She moved to the window and looked out as if the night had information and did not mind sharing. Elijah stood at the threshold. He looked at her profile, and then, because he was a man who believed in keeping up appearances even when no audience purchased a ticket, he put his hand to his heart like a gentleman entering a room. He said, "We're nearly through the worst." She did not turn. She said, "We are not through anything." He stood there until the house told him to move by creaking at him in a tone he heard as disrespect. He left. She stayed. The next morning she went to the quarters. She went at an hour she did not usually go. Miriam met her in the yard. They stood too close if a man had been there to measure propriety. No man was. Maribel said a thing out loud she had not said in any room where God could hear with his good ear. Miriam did not bless or curse. She nodded once. Isaiah joined them by not leaving. The three of them made a triangle out in the open where triangles are dangerous. A bird landed on the fence and tilted its head to watch them. They did not look at the bird. They made a plan that was not yet a plan, because something must begin before it can be named. By the time the frost took the low weeds, the little room had turned into a place where time acted different. Minutes there did not march, they pooled. Sound went thin. A person learned the shape of his own breath and hated it. The windows 3 inches taught the lesson about freedom every prison warden knows. Give a taste of air and the body will crave the gulp until it mistakes craving for duty. Maribel started leaving the back door unlatched during the late hours when a latch usually lived there. She told herself it was habit, She was lying to herself. That is a skill too, lying to oneself toward good ends. Elijah decided the house was an engine and he a mechanic. He spent a morning greasing hinges. He adjusted a lamp wick. He moved the chair in his office 2 inches right and declared the light better that way. He told the doctor to come at dawn. He told the clerk in town to hold a letter 2 days for no reason. He told the girls to rest more, and then knocked before entering a room that used to be his to walk in. He congratulated himself on manners he created for occasions he designed. A man like that can build himself a throne out of the scraps of other people's hours. The parish fair posters peeled on the trees. The bell rope frayed. The road to the city held cart ruts that collected a new season's rain. Rook wrote one more note. Watch the spelling of Rector's name. Elijah corrected it on the next donation. He slept better for having done a polite thing for a person in a different building. Meanwhile, the building he slept in planned his end. The winter didn't come on clean. It dragged mud through the doorway and called itself respectable. The yard stayed soft underfoot longer than any year anyone could remember, and the sky wore a dishwater color that gave a man no permission to call it beautiful. Folks in Aberdeen Parish said you can tell a mean season by how dogs sleep, tight as fists and facing the door. The dogs on Kirsty land slept that way. Noses pointed where trouble would be if trouble wore shoes. By the new year, the house had taught itself to swallow sound. Doors did their work quiet. The stair complained once and then learned manners. A woman could cry in the small room and the noise would go nowhere, as if the walls had been fitted with a throat. Maribel kept to the kitchen when she needed to breathe like a human being. Steam is forgiving company. It accepts a shaking hand without comment, wraps its arms around a woman, and doesn't presume to save her. Elsa started wearing shawls even when it wasn't cold. She said it was for decency, the way a woman talks when men have made language into a currency they spend against her. She sat more than she stood. She put a hand to the small of her back when she did rise, a habit young women have when their spines have learned the price of standing too long in rooms where time meaningfully does not pass. Nora went paler. A girl can go transparent if stared through enough. She cleaned things that were already clean. Doorknobs, the backs of chairs, a lamp base. As if shine were a kind of prayer the Lord might be tricked into hearing in a house he had stopped visiting. Mara learned to disappear without leaving the room. It's a trick particular to girls who've clocked too many hours under inspection. She could be 6 feet away and several counties gone. Elijah told himself the worst of it was over. He said the year had a top and he was standing on it, and all that remained was climb down decent, plant the right seed on the right day, give thanks at table, keep books upright. He was a man equal parts superstition and ledger. He'd begun tapping the pen 3 times before writing a date and turning the key twice when once would do. He spoke softer when he lied, a habit that made him sound kind at the very moments he shouldn't have been allowed an audience. The doctor returned to his Tuesdays. He began bringing a younger man sometimes, an apprentice, he said. Although the boy looked like he'd come out of a kitchen in town and been handed a bag and told to hush. The boy stood by the door and watched the floorboards and learned what men like that learn when they hold a door open for monsters because the monsters pay in cash. He touched his hat to Maribel once and she didn't respond. He learned enough to never try that politeness again. Rook's letters thinned. War had gnawed the roads between men's greed and their paper. But greed doesn't quit. It adapts its shoes. He sent word on a different route, a different clerk's hand. Elijah didn't mind the change. A man who can think like water always finds a channel. He adjusted his symbols in the ledger to account for delay. Little triangles where circles used to sit. A new mark that looked like a brief storm cloud when a date slid. He told himself the page itself approved. He had become a priest in a church with one congregant, and the book replaced the altar stone. A cold snap hit me in late January. The pump handle bit fingers. The yard turned to glass, and then to rutted stone. The river sounded tired. A slow grind like a man who's been told to keep working until his supper arrives and it doesn't. Elsa woke to a weight in her belly that told her the calendar had a different opinion than the one Elijah's marks proposed. She took it quiet, because there are announcements a woman learns to keep to herself until the hour a scream buys her mercy. She counted the gap between pains on her own breath, an economy that doesn't cheat. Maribel felt it from the kitchen, the way a mother feels a house shift on a daughter's inhale. She took her bundle. She did not send for the doctor. If a man means to own the hour a girl is used up, you don't invite him to dinner. The small room made itself ready the way bad places do, smug with purpose. Maribel set the lamp low. She smoothed the quilt. She put the wash basin where her hand knew it would be without looking. She called Elsa by her childhood nickname, and that name did something a medicine couldn't. It brought a little girl into a room where a woman had been forced to stand too fast. The labor went wrong early. The baby came cross. The body isn't a factory. It'll remind any fool of that given the opportunity. Maribel did what women know to do and more. She breathed when Elsa could not. She spoke to bones that were not listening. She turned what could be turned. She refused a God who demanded politeness before mercy. Hours stretched until they stopped being hours and became a narrow bridge across something a person should never look down into. Elsa bled. When the room finally broke open, it did so with a wet breath that did not promise anything but now. The child was small and determined and bright with confusion at the air. Elsa folded, empty and exhausted, not the way a woman sleeps, but the way she drops anchor so the boat stops slamming the pilings. Elijah waited in the hall like a man outside a counting room. He kept his hand flat on the jamb, a gesture he'd learned could look paternal if anyone cared to see it that way. Maribel did not hand him the child. She put the baby to her own shoulder and gave it a minute called human. Elijah disliked minutes like that on principle. He said, "He'll need placing." Maribel didn't look at him. She said, "He'll need not leaving." There are words a man has no practice arguing with when they are said in the tone a woman uses to announce that bread is done or a storm has hit. He moved anyway. He took the child. He did not clap. He did not bless. He signed a mark on the ledger he had pre-written and congratulated his own efficiency silently. He did not sell that child in 3 weeks. The roads were uglier than usual, and a buyer delayed and a clerk had an illness. He paced the office and tapped the pen and turned the key and checked the window latch, and did not bother to ask himself why a 3-week rule had ever been a rule. He hated rules that announced themselves as arbitrary when he himself had invented them. When the sale finally happened, the price shocked even him, high enough to make a man blink. He sat a while with that number in his lap like a sleeping cat and stroked it in his mind. He could hear the mill wheel turning, the one in his head that ground men to flour. He thought briefly of stopping the wheel to see what silence would sound like. The thought passed like an old bird across a wide sky. Nora lost weight she could not spare. She could carry a pail and not carry herself back from the pump without pausing. She hid in the pantry once and sank onto flour sacks, knees up, chin down. She watched dust motes rise like surrender flags and put a fingertip on each as if keeping account would keep something else from leaving. Maribel found her there and sat on the floor too. They did not speak, because speaking takes space a room doesn't allow when it has been fitted for pain. They stayed still until they could stand and look like women the house recognized. Mara watched the bell rope in church and thought of it as a living thing. She imagined a hand that would not tremble. She imagined a night when the rope would not judge her. Some girls pray to saints. Mara prayed to hemp because hemp might answer. She took to walking the long way home past the parsonage, learning the shadow pattern on the yard. She cataloged squeaks and loose stones because, in the end, action is a craft learned like any other. In spring, another pregnancy came hard on the last. Elijah praised the schedule for working like a clock that knows the quarter hour before the bell decides. He told the doctor he had managed intervals well and wanted minimal interruptions. The doctor nodded like a hired man who knows which words fetch a bonus. He asked about more money. Elijah paid. Money is a language men who do not share God speak in well enough. The second child of that year came early, too early. He came with the look new things get when the world's too bright and rough and not quite made to fit them. He struggled. Maribel held him and set a rhythm for the little lungs and made bargains she did not share with anyone. She kept the baby alive through an hour, then 2, then 3. Elijah said, "He won't fetch what you hope." She turned and looked at him then. The look had the weight of a skillet. He took half a step back, a fraction nobody else would have noticed. He wrote a smaller number. The baby lived the day. He lived the night. He lived long enough to teach the room a new shape for the word mercy. Elijah took him in the morning. Maribel watched him walk away down the hall and learned that breath can sound like a rope pulled slow and mean. Isaiah stood by the back stoop and laid his head to the jamb where paint had peeled in a pattern like a map of a country nobody should visit. He thought of a word he had not permitted himself in years, shame, and turned it over. He chickened his jaw and reminded himself that shame is something a free man affords himself when he has the ability to pay for it. A man under orders is liable to confuse shame with fuel. He decided he would not burn on that kind of fire. He decided, too, that fuel would be gathered anyway. The ledger thickened. The spine learned to flex in ways it hadn't. The pages near the beginning developed a run of thumb oil, a darker edge that comes from handling a thing too often. Elijah began adding a new category: contingencies. He wrote it neatly. He liked the word. It suggested wisdom where there was only appetite. He began to test the room for possibilities he hadn't yet exploited. He considered moving one woman from the big house to the quarters for efficiency. He wondered how long a body could be kept useful with minimal food and maximum orders. He had become a man who experiments, the kind of man who should be watched by someone sworn to stand between a citizen and harm. No one stood there. Citizens like Elijah build the wall and stand on both sides and call it law. The parish bell rang one afternoon in a way that teased at memory. Once, twice, then the rope sighed as if making a note to itself. Mara was in the church then. She listened like the bell had leaned down to share a secret. The preacher was away, and the sexton in the yard, and the door unlatched. She stepped to the rope and let it touch her palm. The hemp had a body's warmth. She did not pull. She learned this time a lesson last time hadn't taught. A bell rung too early as a door opened onto a blank field. She palmed the rope, let it know her, and left with the sound knotted small and deliberate inside her chest. Another room in the body learned another trick when Nora, pushed beyond sense by a pain that would not declare itself, but would insist, took herself to the pantry and took something off the shelf meant to ease the ache of men's pride and seeded it into tea. She drank. The room slowed. She breathed. The world moved away an inch. She folded the cloth exactly twice and tucked it into the space between her waist and her skirt. The fact that a girl can learn to do such things without a teacher is a curse older than any Bible in a Louisiana church. Maribel began to step different. She carried herself like a woman who has decided, not like a woman practicing the idea of deciding. She moved in and out of rooms like she was measuring exits. Her eyes started to slide past Elijah when he spoke as if he were a bad painting in a town hall, too large to ignore, too ugly to look at. He noticed, because men like him always notice when the ground shifts under a boot that has never known mud it couldn't bull through. He told himself she would come to heal. He fed himself that sentence 3 times a day and called it nourishment. Sheriff's deputy came again, sat on the step casual and told a story about a jailbreak upriver that sounded half lied and half copied from some other deputy's mouth. He asked after the family, as if a man doing his job could make small talk with a fire he had no intention of putting out. Elijah said the women were healthy. The deputy said his sister-in-law had a new baby. Maribel stood in the door and said, "May the child live." The deputy looked at her like a man who suspects he's been praying wrong and doesn't intend to start praying right. The sale that followed came with a request. A buyer wanted to know if the papers could be altered to suggest a different parish of origin to avoid certain men who had begun putting names to circumstances. Elijah wrote back yes, and made a list in his head of who the certain men must be. He recalculated routes. He plotted where the river would forgive a weight, and which ferrymaster owed who. He put a hand on the ledger and did not register that the skin under his palm had gone thin. Late summer produced a child that arrived wrong. Not cross, not breech. Wrong in a way that made the room consider new definitions of hope. The baby did not cry properly. He made a mew sound like a cat dreaming. He flailed slow, like he was swimming in thicker air than the rest of them were allotted. Maribel put her knuckle in his palm and felt the squeeze. There it was, a will to hold something. She said aloud, softly, "That's enough." Elijah said, "It isn't enough to carry a value." She did not look at him. She said, "A child doesn't carry value. A child carries breath." He said nothing because the words were spoken like tools laid on a table men don't know how to use. The baby died at dusk, a decent hour for endings. Maribel washed him and wrapped him and refused to let the room forget it had been sacred for 20 minutes. She would not allow a ledger to have the last say. She put the bundle in Miriam's hands and dared the heir to disagree. Miriam went to the pecan. Isaiah dug. Nobody said spoilage. They didn't even whisper that useful syllable, loss. They put the child down the way a person sets a heavy book on a shelf where it belongs. Careful, respectful, certain it will be needed again in a better story. In the days after, Mara's anger ripened. There is a point where anger separates from fear and becomes architecture. She began to imagine rooms designed for an ending that didn't involve a sale or a signature. She cleaned the parlor the way a man sharpens a blade, slow, even strokes, attention to the edge. She watched Elijah's roots through the house and knew where his heel hit first on each stair. She timed his trips to the city by the shadows in the yard and could smell a plan fermenting in her blood. Isaiah came to the back step at dusk one day with his cap crushed in his hand and his eyes set in a way that said war without the noise. He said, "Miss Maribel." She said, "Yes." He said, "There'll need to be a night." She looked at the yard, which held no opinion. She looked at the kitchen, which had taught itself to say amen when necessary and shut up the rest of the time. She said, "I know." He did not tell her about rope or trail or which bend in the road keeps a secret. She did not ask. The plan had been built piece by their silence. They only had to step into it. Elijah was not a man to lay down all weapons at once. He stepped up his schedule when he felt a press in the air. He tightened intervals. He locked doors he had not bothered with in months. He called the doctor twice in a week and paid him a week early. A dog owner tossing meat to a beast he isn't sure will bite him eventually. He asked Isaiah to confirm head counts at dusk and at dawn. He told Miriam to scrub the small room proper. He told the girls to rest and keep to their rooms for their health. A man can make any order sound gentlemanly if he learned to speak in rooms where law wears silk. Maribel took a walk to the church in a daytime hour, a boldness, and touched the bell rope again lightly with a knuckle. She imagined it would answer for her if she didn't ask it to. She turned and saw the sexton looking. The sexton had eyes like bottle glass, green and unclear. He nodded as if to say he saw nothing. The Lord picks strange shepherds. You take the ones who keep the gate open and don't ask them for hymns. The night came mean and close. The air had a film to it like the sky had been pouring lard instead of rain. Elijah went to the card den beyond the parish line because a habit insists on being itself, even when seasons turn murderous. He drank just enough to make the reins feel like rope and the horse like a boat and the road like a river. He spoke to a man about cane futures, and to another about whether a sheriff ought to be elected by men who own the most fence. He won a hand and then lost 3, and then left with the self he most liked intact, the self who would be thanked by ground for walking on it. On the trail back, where the cane thins and the sycamores edge in, there's a turn that refuses to indicate its sharpness. Isaiah knew it. Maribel knew it. 2 other men from the quarters knew it because men who work land could draw its bones with their eyes closed. They waited where the dark thickens, and a horse's ear goes quick as a fish in a bucket. They did not speak. Men like that have learned to keep their tongues behind their teeth until it's time to bite. Elijah's horse shied at a click, a sound as small as a man requests when he asks for permission to enter a room he already owns. The animal went half sideways. Isaiah came from the left like a shadow introduced to grief. Maribel had the reins before the horse could decide between fight and flight. The two other men put weight where weight makes a body remember the floor. Elijah fell clean, like a sack full of bookends. No grace. No fight left that wasn't the sort done with paper. He saw the stars in the crack between branches the way a child looks for holes in a quilt. There was a smell. Iron, horse, river. There was a sound. His own breath caught by a hand. They didn't talk about the why because why had been made obvious on too many nights in too many rooms. They didn't waste scripture on the how. They made it fast. Not kind. There is no kindness owed at an ending like that. Only speed and the decency to not let a man false confess to a God he never talked to before. When it was done, they staged the scene like men stage acts for a little theater nobody admits paying to watch. Maribel took the ring from Elijah's finger because a dead man shouldn't own anything that touched a woman's skin. Isaiah cut the saddle cinch just enough to tell a true story in the morning. The men scattered coins like a sloppy thief's pockets had misbehaved. They hurt the horse enough to make its eyes tell what eyes tell when something wicked finds them and then leaves them to be believed. Dawn brought a neighbor with a cart and a mouthful of talk. The deputy came with a pad like law in this parish uses pads to cover its shame. He wrote, "Bandits," because a man loves a category that doesn't ask him to attend a family's sins. He did not ask to see the book in the office. He did not ask to look to the bolts that face inward. He did not ask why a woman's hands looked like she'd rinsed them all night in water, too clean to be kitchen water. He stood on the gallery and told Maribel he was sorry for her loss like a boy reciting a psalm he'd learned by beating. He tipped his hat to the girls and left the brim down too long for it to mean respect, and not the relief of a man avoiding eyes. The parish went about its day. Men mentioned a rise in crime. Women told each other softly that widows ought to keep shutters tight the first week. The preacher did not adjust his sermon. The bell rang once for a death and once for an evening service. The rope recognized a new weight when Maribel took it that afternoon and put her palm to the knots. She walked home light as a woman can carry a body and did not trip on the step. After the burial, hastier than dignified, more dignified than deserved, Maribel freed the house of the ledger. She did it at a strange hour between supper and dark, when the day behaves like an old dog asleep under a table. She opened the tin box. The key was where it always was, in plain sight to a man who imagined hiding works better in front of his own face. She lifted the book and did not touch it with the tips of her fingers. She put her whole hand around it, a grasp that says, "A thing will not slip, even if a wall shakes." She walked to the back. She passed the kitchen, because a stove will keep a secret. But smoke tells neighbors more than it tells God, and she had no time for either audience. She went to the yard, to the place behind the shed where the ground sinks and the soil is honest. She dug shallow. She wasn't burying history. She was postponing it. She wrapped the book in oilcloth and hemp and laid it down. She covered the hole. She patted it with a flat palm. She did not mark the spot. She would remember. Bones remember. Then she unlatched the back door and left it as if a gust had done it, because the last order Elijah had ever given the house had been to keep every latch firm, and his language did not deserve the last word. She went to her daughters. She sat at the foot of Elsa's bed and said, "You will sleep now." She stood in Nora's doorway and nodded, and the girl nodded back as if they had exchanged as much promise as a disciplined army can afford. She lay beside Mara on top of the quilt, not to keep her warm, but to weigh her down just enough to remind her body that gravity was a choice they were making together. Isaiah didn't come by that night. He kept to the quarters, sat with the men, and did not talk. Miriam made coffee with a pinch of salt because a body needs to be reminded it's got a mouth for something other than swallowing orders. They put their backs to the wall like folks do when nobody is coming and they need to pretend somebody is. A child fell asleep mid-laugh and woke afraid of why he'd been happy. Abina breathed like someone had counted her inhales and told her there were only so many left. She meant to stretch each one. Abel ran a whetstone over a blade but had no plans for it. Plans make a noise, and the night had had enough. In the morning, the house felt taller. The air had changed shape, not sweeter, not safer, like a storm cloud had moved off and left a different heat pressing down. Maribel went to the office and cleaned it like a guest room for a man who would never stay there again. She took the blotter and laid it in the fire. She watched it go. She dipped the nib and then set it aside. She left the key where it had always been, as a joke only she would laugh at. The girls did not laugh. They moved slow, as if stepping across a floor someone had pulled all the nails from. The day passed with the sound of a clock that belonged to nobody. The sheriff came, not the deputy, and removed his hat, and stood like a man who knows better than to say words he doesn't mean. He asked if there was anything he should know about the night. Maribel looked at him and said, "You ought to know what kind of men ride your road after midnight." He nodded. He did not ask to walk the house, and for that she didn't hate him. He left, and the news moved through the parish like a small animal under hedges. Low, quick, felt more than seen. Some women looked at their husbands different, and some husbands noticed and decided to make jokes to smooth it, and some did not. The preacher preached on Providence the next Sabbath and caught Maribel's eye and shifted course mid-verse without losing his place. A man who can change message on the fly might be good for some other fight someday. She filed him under possible. With Elijah dead, the machine jammed. It didn't stop because houses built as engines aren't given to stopping just because a hand is taken off the crank. But gears clashed, schedules slipped. Papers didn't line up with seals. Rook sent one letter that arrived late, fat with assumptions that made no sense to a widow. Maribel wrote back a polite nothing that said as much as those letters ever had. The doctor came Tuesday and stood on the porch and asked if he was needed. Maribel said, "We'll call." And he nodded and left like a man leaving a battlefield he had never officially entered. Maribel freed the enslaved that week, not with a parade, not with the law, with a door. She told Isaiah to collect everyone at dusk. She stood on the back gallery and said, "I cannot change the world." She said, "I can open the door." She said, "If you go, I won't call anyone with a badge you shouldn't trust anyway." Some cried, some didn't. Some packed with the patience of people for whom leaving is a skill and a curse. Miriam kissed Maribel's cheek, something someone might call insolent in another story. In this one, it was communion. Isaiah set his cap and said he'd tend to certain things and then go. Maribel nodded. She didn't ask him where. A free man's direction is his business. Elsa's third baby came in August. He came with both fists closed, white-knuckled as a sailor. The delivery nearly took her. It would have if the room had its way. Maribel didn't bargain this time. She took what was owed by hands and blood and a fierce attention. She set a rhythm, old as women, new as any hour a life enters a place and decides to stay. The child cried with the sound of a healthy insult. Elsa saw him, and something that had been hauled up the stairs nightly and tied to the bedpost for months loosened. She held him. She did not let go. Maribel did not argue placement or schedule. She fetched water. She cleaned. She called Nora. She told Mara to sit. She handed the baby back to Elsa and said, "Now." Nora never would be right. There are bodies that get asked to hold too much and decide they will attend but not recover. She developed a tremor that made soup look like river water in a saucer. She learned to laugh with her hand on her forearm, the way a woman will find a brace where none is offered. Mara would never be sweet in the way people like in girls. She carried a blade nobody could see into every room and used it less and less. She did not have to draw it for folks to feel it near. Maribel sold what could be sold. Land went by parcel. She kept the house long enough to see the corners fill with light that did not hum like a humming wire. She walked the rooms and told them their names and told them they were done with certain duties. She packed a trunk that did not carry shame because someone had to see that shame wasn't the only cargo the house knew how to set on a wagon. She found the place in the yard where the ledger lay and considered digging. She didn't. Some books need to rot. The worms deserve a say. Isaiah came to the back steps one late evening when lizards clicked under the boards and said he would go in 2 nights. He did not cry. He stood like a tree that has decided how to split a storm. He said, "I will not see this place again." Maribel said, "I know." He said, "I am going to a place where a man can carry his own name without it tearing a hole in his pocket." She said, "You carry ours with you without it doing harm." He nodded once. He turned. He left for good. She watched him go and did not wave. Waving is for men who will look back. He did not. Miriam left with 2 women and a boy whose laughter had learned to regulate itself. She carried a bundle and a spine that had remembered itself under the weight and decided not to bend anymore unless it was to pick up a child. She settled where needle and thread could buy privacy. She unlearned the way her hands had learned to move when they were being watched for tremor. She did not speak of Kirsty land. She taught another girl to cut a hem straight. That is a kind of freedom you can hold. Rook died in a fight over a woman and a card. Or he moved upriver and opened a new office with a different bird on the shingle. Or he was shot in a riot 2 parishes east. Men like him end in stories told over cheap whiskey by men their wives call liars. Nobody kept his ledger. That's the thing with men who sell paper. They always believe someone else will archive their sins. Paper is kinder to men like him than it is to women like Maribel and girls like Elsa. Paper will hold a lie longer than a woman's hand will hold a grudge. One of those is more useful than the other. The sheriff died 10 years later, ignorant of the shape of the night he had filed under bandits. His successor tried to be better, and sometimes he was, and sometimes he wasn't. The preacher outlived everyone's patience and moved to another parish where his sermons straightened a bit, as if somebody had finally told him which ridge of his back had been out all that time. The deputy's brother got his hand caught in a gin and lost 3 fingers and learned a different humility. The clerk retired with a box of seals which his niece used as decorations for children's letters one Christmas. The world has ways of making beauty from scraps. Sometimes that comforts, sometimes it should not. The big house stood a while, then sagged, then got taken down 1 beam at a time, by men who were paid by a man who had never heard the names of the women whose voices stayed trapped in its walls. The timbers went to a barn 2 counties over. The porch boards got sold cheap to a man who made benches for a school. Boys carved initials into wood that once heard Maribel teach herself to lie 9 different ways for a good cause. A girl dropped her lunch and laughed on a step built from a hallway where Mara learned to make her breath a knife. That is how ghosts earn a rest if they ever do. By being sat on by children who deserve a world with less weight. Elsa lived with a stiffness in her gait and a softness in her voice she had not had before she met a ledger and decided to defy it. She called her son by his name and not by a mark. She would not let anyone shorten it. She would not keep another child. She did anyway, because life is not polite to women's intentions. She loved small, fierce, daily, the way a person polishes 1 spoon in a drawer and leaves the rest dull. Nora kept bees a while and hummed to them under her breath, learning the song they answer best. She married a man who spoke less than she needed, and more than she would have thought she could stand. They found a way to count together. Mara didn't marry at all. She took in mending and stories and made both better than they were when they arrived. She pulled a girl out of a doorway once by the elbow and said, "Not that way." And the girl never stood in that doorway again. That is a kind of sermon. Maribel carried guilt like women carry keys, in a pocket, palmed, ready, not displayed. She asked God for the strength to know what she had done and the grace to not make poetry out of it. She did not flinch when she remembered the road and the rains and the sound a body makes when the world decides to stop listening to it. She baked bread on Sundays and did not apologize when 2 loaves went stale because they were there for someone who didn't arrive. She died with her eyes open and her mouth set and her hand on a chair's arm, like she was not about to get up and would never again be made to. The girls washed her and wrapped her and did not speak. Silence as grammar, silence as respect, silence as refusal. Years later, a plow hit something where the shed once stood. The farmer cursed and bent to it and found oilcloth black as riverbed. He cut it with his pocket knife and found a book with brass at the corners and a smell like mouse and ink and rain. He opened it. The pages showed him a language he could read and couldn't bear to. He closed it fast, as if a wasp had been sleeping in there and woke mad. He carried it to the house and set it on a shelf with the insurance forms and a photograph of a dog. He told himself he'd take it to the parish office. He didn't. His wife put a fern on top of it. The fern died and left a ring. The ring's shape outlasted the marriage. The book stayed until a flood decided it would move, and it moved. The river ate what paper it liked and let the rest go. That is as much justice as that water offers. On certain nights when the air sits wrong and the frogs forget their lines, and the wind puts its palm on the side of a house like it's checking for a fever, folks say they hear a bell that nobody rang. It hits once, low and real, and then leaves. It doesn't wake children. It doesn't bring men to doors. It doesn't call women to kitchens. It announces nothing. It remembers. There are bells like that in bone, too. They ring twice in a life if a person is unlucky and pays attention. Once when the first small wrong is done in a room where it should have been unsayable. And once when someone ends the man who started it and the house decides it will be a house again, not an engine. The ledger, if it had a mouth, would make a case for itself. It would say it only took the shapes a hand made, and the words a brain supplied, that it didn't choose blue ink or a symbol that looked like a seed, or a mark that looked like a fishhook. It would ask to be absolved. It would be wrong. Objects are not guilty the way men are, but they carry guilt like the woman carried keys. In a parish like this, wood learns, paper learns, rope learns, glass learns. A bell learns the weight of a palm and remembers when a different palm asks if the world might be told something new. In a county 3 over, a woman puts her hand to her back when she stands. In a city warm all year, a man signs his name in a book that licks up the ink and holds it and wonders why his fingers shake after. In a northern town with smoke that smells different, a man named Isaiah puts his feet up and looks at a road that doesn't ask anything of him, an honest stare between a man and a surface that will carry him without needing to be won or threatened. He hears a bell one night, a wrong bell, a perfect bell. He doesn't get up. He lets the ring sit on his chest. He says aloud, to nobody, yes. The word goes into a room where a book rotted and a woman opened a door and a girl kept her shoes on because she had to, and it finds a chair and sits. The season after a storm is a strange kind of quiet. Not the hush of a prayer, not the peace men brag about when they confuse silence with virtue. It is the quiet of rooms that have forgotten what they were built for and wait to be told again. Aberdeen Parish woke into that kind of morning after Elijah Kirsty went to ground, as if going to ground were the only honest act he'd managed. The house stood up straighter and, by some trick of light, shorter. A dog stretched and yawned and chose a new place to sleep. The porch boards creaked in a new pitch, lower, tired, relieved. The law did not come back around with questions that mattered. There were forms to fill and a corner of a ledger at the parish office that asked for a line or two. A death marked as robbery, the sort of category that eats detail and leaves a chalk outline that pleases men who file papers. The deputy wrote slow, not because he cared, but because writing fast makes ink puddle and puddles make clerks frown. The sheriff had already put his hat back on and rested 2 fingers on the brim in a gesture that meant he was a decent man, according to his own understanding. When he left, his boots made no promise to return. Good men in places like this often mistake not staying for impartiality. Maribel counted furniture, not because she meant to sell each piece, though she would, but because naming what you can move is a way to survive what you cannot. The big bed in the room with the north window, the table with the 3 scratches like boot heels, the blue dish a girl chipped and cried over once because a father raised his voice too quick. She set what could go in one column, what would be burned in another. What would be left to spite a memory in a third? She put the ledgers, the household, the seed, the accounts everyone agrees women ought to keep, on the table and ran a cloth over them, just to remind paper that it should be asked to serve life, not command it. She freed the people who could be freed with the only tool she had: permission. It was not law. It would do, until better arrived. The gate was left open at dusk, a dangerous hour for favors, and names were spoken one last time the way a woman says the name of a son who won't live close anymore. Isaiah left with 2 men and a woman and did not look back. Not because looking back would have been a betrayal, but because the eyes are not a bottomless well, and his had work to do up the road. Miriam folded a shawl over her shoulder, lifted a small bundle, and carried a grief no man had paid her for. Abina had a hand on the boy Abel's shoulder. He tried to walk faster than fear and slowed when he realized fear knows every shortcut anyway. Maribel did not sleep those first nights because night is not the kind of animal that lets you pet it if you've been too long in rooms where locks face inward. She sat at the table with a lamp turned low and a knife laid beside her hand, not for use, but because the blade was a promise about what the hand would do if doors forgot the new rules. The girls moved in the house like people who had memorized where to put feet to keep quiet. It took them time to accept that noise wouldn't punish them. A plate fell on the second day and did not shatter. Nora cried anyway. Some sounds are tied to old sentences. It takes years to untie a knot someone else tied you with. Elsa's 3rd child gulped air the way a man drinks water after a long walk. He had a way of making the room feel like it wanted to work again. Babies do that. They have no knowledge of what the roof has heard. They care only that the world keeps its promise of warmth. Elsa played the part of the woman she had been before schedules and marks, smiled once or twice without looking over her shoulder to see if the expression would be taxed. She had a new gait, a small favor given to pain that would not quit, but it was hers. She would never again let a man put a price over anything that walked out of her body. Nora learned to sit in a chair without clenched fists. The tremor that had set in found a rhythm. She learned to pour sugar with 2 hands, thumb steady on the lip, the way old men pour whiskey when they intend it to land where it ought to. She took up bees for a while, hives at the edge of a plot she rented in a neighbor's kindness. The bees answered to a hum she discovered in her chest that wasn't anxiety. She liked the sting when it came, not because she wanted pain, but because it announced its own logic and asked no ledger for permission. Mara did not soften. Sweetness is not a duty a girl owes to anyone, and the world had spent her allotment early. She took to mending, not because the town needed a seamstress, though it did, but because fixing things that wanted to hold together anyway made more sense than talking to men who believed the Lord had sworn oath to the power of their hands. She mended tears where a knee goes, places that say a person knelt too long, and hems worn thin by girls who learned to walk in their sleep. She took in stories too, the way women in towns like this always do, and trimmed them where they dragged and stitched them where they'd been used as ropes. The sale of land went the way these things go. Men with pencils and hats got together and shook hands over acres their boots had never seen wet. The boundary stones were consulted as if stones know how to speak in ways that protect women. The surveyor talked about rods and chains and points of bearing. Maribel learned his language long enough to keep him from taking more than his due. She sold the North Field to a man who swore he'd plant cane like a religion. She sold the pecan grove to a widow who hadn't forgiven a tree since a limb dropped in a storm and scared her into believing in lightning again. She kept back the yard for a time, long enough to see the house fall asleep without flinching. The ledger in the dirt stayed there, sinking slow, learning rot. Maribel considered digging it up once. It was a moon-bright night where the kind of decision men call dramatic feels like the only sensible thing to do. She stood over the spot with a spade and realized she didn't want to be the one to take it back into air. Some histories are safer in the hands of worms. The ground knows what to do with shame if you feed it straight. People don't. People recite, they publish, they trade paper for absolution that never arrives. A year later, A boy plowing for a new owner struck something with the blade. He cussed in a way that made the mules switch their tails. He bent, found oilcloth and brass corners. He looked at the house, at the woman who had bought it in parcels, at his own hands that had learned not to open anything he wasn't ready to see. He put the bundle in a shed and told himself he'd bring it to town. He told his wife later that he had almost brought trouble into their kitchen. The almost kept him good company. He learned to not step there. Barley grew up over the place and did what barley does. Learned sun, learned water, minded its own green business. Time traveled the way it always does, a river that spends no sentences on rocks. The war ended, at least the kind men knew how to write down. The other wars, the ones kitchens hold, the ones in beds, the ones that hide behind words like order and duty, kept a slower calendar. A road got graded. A store opened where a feed shed had stood. The preacher moved on. A younger man came who had read newer books and older ones with fresh eyes and managed once to preach a sermon about justice that made a deacon cough into his hand and look at the floor. The sheriff passed, and the next man took the badge and wore it like a penknife. Useful sometimes, dangerous others. The benches made from the old porch board sat in a school 2 counties over. Boys carved hearts and letters into wood that had heard a ledger open and close like breathing. A girl balanced a slate on her knees and worked sums over grain that remembered a woman laying a hand flat to keep from shaking. Those benches held more children than that porch had held mercy. They collected gum and scuffs and lullabies smuggled into arithmetic, and that was a fair trade for the nights they had met. Elsa's boy learned to walk early and to take direction from women without resenting it. He had 2 cowlicks, one that made his hair insist on a map to nowhere, another that pointed, stubborn, to the left. He grew into a man who worked with both hands and made a habit of leaving doors open behind him. He told his mother he'd never own a ledger like the one that lived under their ground, and she told him all men own ledgers even if they pretend otherwise. She meant his heart. He didn't argue. He made a practice of writing down debts to people instead of debts from them. Folks called him soft behind his back until he got a neighbor's mule out of a ditch in rain, and no one sneered about softness for a season. Nora married a man who understood quiet. He had the good sense to not ask what had changed her voice. He gave her a hive for their first anniversary, a ridiculous gift if you ask men who think a woman's joy is a tidy field. She laughed, and the laugh landed true. She stayed thin and got strong, the way willow gets strong, by learning to bend where ash would break. She never had a child. She held others, and it was enough, and some days it was not, and she learned to stand up into both truths at once. Mara did not sign papers that would put her name under a man's. She rented a room above a shop and paid cash, and held a little knife in her pocket when she walked home late. She kept 3 things on her table: a lamp, a spool of thread, and a rock from the river. The rock was smooth and flat and had a stripe through it that made it look like it had once held a page in place. She put her hand on it when the town got loud. She turned away 2 men who thought she'd be softened by time and 1 woman who thought they were the same kind. She wasn't unkind, only sure. She sat by the church on days the bell didn't ring and felt a shadow slide through her bones that wasn't fear anymore, just the memory of fear, which is a different animal. You can look it in the eyes. Maribel lasted longer than people who saw the set of her mouth expected. Guilt is not always a quick disease. It can be managed with work and weather and small gladnesses. She learned to bake bread she was not ashamed of letting go stale when no one came. She took a scissor to sheets and made shirts, then took a scissor to talk and made it shorter when folks wanted a longer story she did not owe. She walked to the fence line every Sunday with a cup of coffee and told the pecan what it had stood witness to, and then told it what it would never see again. She did not confess herself to anyone who might answer. She died one morning when the light came up wrong and right at once. Elsa found her in a chair, hand on the arm as if holding steady were a final act of will. The girls washed her and wrapped her. They did not read any book over her because sometimes a body has earned a silence that doesn't ask angels or men to speak for it. The town remembered Elijah, in the way towns remember men who made money in trouble. Some said he'd been hard but fair, meaning he had been hard in ways that benefited them. Some said he'd been smart with paper, as if smart were the same as good. Some said bandits got him, grim with satisfaction that the world still had a few straight lines left. Very few remembered anything that required them to look at the bolts that faced inward. The ones who did remember chose to aim their memory at ground, not mouths. A generation passed. Boys who'd been told to avoid the old place went there with slingshots and stole a dare off each other. Girls walked with their skirts lifted from burrs and looked at the house site and saw wildflowers where a porch had been, then wondered why their throats went tight. People stopped using certain names, not in shame exactly, but in reverence for the way saying a name can put fingerprints on a ghost. One year the river came up wrong and took what the ground had been keeping. It pulled at fences and unseated stones and rearranged a plot or two because rivers don't bow to grieving. It licked at the spot behind the old shed and found the oilcloth. It worried it open and tugged the book into air. It dropped it half a mile downstream where a tangle of willow caught it. A boy from a house that had never been asked to learn the old story found it and brought it home proud, like a trophy fish he didn't have to gut. His mother opened it and read and closed it, and opened it again, and the room tilted around her. She carried it to the church with both hands and set it on the front pew. The preacher, who had not been born when the book was written and did not know his voice could do anything heavier than marriage in June, put his hand on the cover as if swearing in, then lifted it and saw what men like him are usually part of covering up. They did not read it aloud. There is no good in giving fresh breath to that particular grammar. But the preacher wrote a letter no one asked him to write and sent it downriver to another room where paper is supposed to help people instead of trap them. Nothing much came of it. Sometimes nothing is the right size for what is asked. But at a service 3 Sundays later, he left his notes on the pulpit and spoke about bolts that face inward and how the house of the Lord insists on latches turned the other way. A woman in the third pew fanned herself slow and did not faint. A man in the back shifted, because some words are shoes that don't fit and men resent a pinch even when it keeps them from tripping. In other counties, other ledgers stayed put. In other houses, the bolts kept faith with the wrong side of doors. The world keeps a long list of places where law and profit make a din that drowns hollers. But Aberdeen Parish had one less engine and one more kitchen, where steam made forgiveness possible for 10 minutes at a time. Folks say the bell in that church still rings once in the evening sometimes for no reason anyone will admit. Children do not notice. Old men hear it and tell boys to hush. Women hear it and put a hand to the table or the bedpost or the small of their backs. It is not a haunting. It is a check-in, a call and response where the answer is simple and not sweet. Still here. Elsa's boy grew and married and learned to leave the door unlatched when the day was kind. He taught his own boy to oil a hinge and not to ever lock a person inside a room that wasn't a doctor's room with a nurse standing by. He used words like, "not in this house," more than he used any word for pride. People called him soft again and got a fence fixed in a morning for it. Nora's hives swarmed twice. She caught one and lost the other and taught another woman how to suit up and cut comb without crushing it. The honey tasted like clover and something older. She sold it at the fair in jars with no labels because labeling is a game for men who need to make lines. Mara kept making and mending. She became the kind of woman boys lowered their voices around without knowing why, and girls stood taller near without being told a thing. The ground learned to keep what was right to keep. It holds footsteps, and the whisper of a rope, and the place where a woman stood with a spade and chose the worm over the word. Some afternoons when the light lays flat and the pecans throw a long, patient shade, the yard looks like any other yard in any other parish. Grass, ants, a path worn where people prefer to walk. If a person stands there and closes their eyes and lays a palm out to the air, they might feel 2 weights at once. The weight of what was done and the weight of what was refused after. Both are honest. Both belong. One of them is lighter, but not by much. That's how truth gets carried. Up north, Isaiah sat more than he stood by the time the first gray came in. He learned men's names and kept his own. He took work that didn't require him to look over his shoulder to find his face in a white man's eye. He built a table with a top, so smooth a man could see his reflection if he leaned right and the light cooperated. He didn't put any ledgers on it. He used it for bread, for cards played for joy, for a girl who married his son-in-law to set her first jar of pickles and ask if anybody had a better recipe. He heard, once in a while, a bell that didn't belong in that climate. He let the sound come and go. He didn't stand. He didn't salute. He said under his breath, "No more," and the room agreed. Miriam made a home where women knew how to keep a needle in air without a man telling them when to set it down. She never spoke Aberdeen's name in that new place. Some nouns are best kept in the seam allowance. She laughed with her hand over her mouth the first year, then remembered it was her own hand and moved it. She had a son. She named him something nobody on Kirsty land would have the right to shorten. She took in work when she wanted and didn't when she didn't, and learned the art of a good no, which is a finer form of needlework than any bishop's lace. Rook, if he lived long enough to be old, died not in the manner of men who repent, but in the manner of men who get hit by the back of the same hand they spent years sending out under other names. Or he died rich and fat with rings on his fingers, and a cook who put too much salt on his food when he'd been unkind. There is no profit in giving him a clean end. The world will sort men like him into drawers no preacher has to dust. The church never made a plaque for Maribel, nor should it have. Plaques go green around the edges and invite men to stand with hats in hands and think they did something. Her memorial was the way the next woman who found her husband's ledger shut it, hard, and took a walk to the river instead of to the courthouse. It was the way a mother in town told a daughter, "If the lock faces in, you tell me," and then kept an ear for latches. It was the way the bell rope felt when pulled by a hand that would not tremble anymore. Not a call for help this time, but a roll call for the living. People like to tidy storied ground with phrases. They call the place haunted, as if ghosts prefer fields where the real action is over and all that's left is the telling. The ground does not use such words. It knows what it knows. Footsteps, the weight of a body stored honest or hidden, the habit some houses have of swallowing sound, the marvelous fact of a door unlatched. It keeps secrets if secrets are asked to serve the living. It gives up evidence when evidence can teach a man how to turn a bolt the right way around. It does not force conclusions, only offers a patient stage for anyone willing to stand and refuse or confess. There are storm nights yet, when the wind lays a palm on a window and asks a house a question it cannot answer. On those nights, the bell rings sometimes, once, twice, and no one claims the rope. That's fitting. Not every sound needs a witness to have weight. In the morning, children go to school and scratch their initials on benches made of oak from someplace else. A woman turns a jar of honey until the light runs through it and remembers a room where steam gave her 10 minutes of pardon. A man, somewhere north, turns a table's grain under his thumb and decides to sand the rough places out because he can. The world does not get right, not in a way any ledger would sign off on. It gets honest enough sometimes for a breath. If someone stands by the old yard and closes their eyes, they might hear a voice that sounds like a book shutting. Soft, final, not dreadful. It says without sweetness, with a decency learned from poor teachers and good neighbors, done. A person could open their eyes then and see a field. Not a theater, not a court, not a ledger laid open like a wound. Just a field, grass, ants, a path where feet know to go. There are worse endings. There have been worse beginnings. Between them, a bell that rings now and again and a door that learned which way its latch should face. That is the truth the ground keeps, and the only history a house can live with and still call itself a home.